Welcome, everybody. Today's special Grand Rounds is being co-hosted with Psychiatry and the USC Center for Mindfulness Science. Before we move to introductions, I just want to make a quick announcement for those of us in psychiatry who are faculty providing services at LAC USC. You should have already received your individualized link for the Spring 2022 Provider Time Study. If you have not, please contact Liz Blevins Marinakis, as you should have gotten that Saturday or Sunday this past weekend when the time study opened. It is a mandatory Spring 2022 physician time study, otherwise known as PTS. And as I said, it started April 16th and it will run till April 29th. If you have any questions, please contact Liz. And now it is my pleasure to turn the floor over to Dr. Rael Khan, who is the director for the USC Center for Mindfulness Science, who's going to introduce our special guest speaker, Dr. Antonio Dimaggio.
Thank you so much, Barbara. Greetings, everyone, and thank you so much for joining this lecture today. Today's Department of Psychiatry Grand Rounds is co-sponsored by the USC Center for Mindfulness Science, a center here at USC composed of faculty from many departments and schools interested in contributing to a deeper understanding of mindfulness, contemplative practices, and their utility in supporting health, well-being, and human flourishing. It is a great honor and a distinct pleasure to be introducing Dr. Antonio Dimaggio today. Dr. Damasio is Dornsife Professor of Neuroscience, Psychology, and Philosophy, and the Director of the Brain and Creativity Institute at USC, where I've had the pleasure to have a home, a lab for the last 7 years since joining the USC faculty. In addition to his work as a neurologist and neuroscientist of the highest caliber, Dr. Damasio is a deep scholar and philosopher of the mind. During the 1960s, Dr. Damasio studied medicine at the University of Lisbon Medical School, where he also did his neurological residency and completed his doctorate. For part of his studies, he researched behavioral neurology under the supervision of Norman Geschwind in the Aphasia Research Center in Boston, before moving to the University of Iowa, where he was chair of the Department of Neurology and had a large lab with his wife and partner, Dr. Hannah Damasio, for many years, before eventually moving to USC about 15 years ago. Dr. Damasio has made seminal contributions to the understanding of brain processes underlying affect and consciousness. His work on the role of emotions and feelings in decision-making has made a major impact in neuroscience, psychology, and philosophy. He's also the author of several hundred scientific articles and considered one of the most eminent psychologists of the modern era and one of the most cited scientists worldwide. Because I want to give Dr. Damasio the floor, I won't go into the many additional paragraphs of introduction I could give, and just end by saying that Dr. Damasio's recent work addresses the evolutionary development of mind and the role of life regulation in the generation of cultures. Recent books on the subject include The Strange Order of Things, Life, Feeling, and the Making of Cultures, and the recently published Feeling and Knowing, Making Minds Conscious. And of particular relevance to people in the field of mindfulness science, contemplative science research, Dr. Damasio's findings and body of knowledge have really provided a intellectual framework for us to be attempting to really give an explanatory power to how and why mindfulness and contemplative practices may be of such benefit for human health and well-being. In particular, the strong findings related to the role of the body, the somatic marker hypothesis, and the role of bodily awareness in the making of feelings and emotions, and the relationship between those attention to those domains as opposed to narration, and the theoretical import as related to meditative practice has really been a a talking point for many in the contemplative science field. So just helps to motivate a little bit the interest in this. And I'm going to stop sharing the screen and turn it over to Dr. Damasio now. Thank you so much for speaking with us today.
Thank you, Rael. Great pleasure to be here, meaning there, everywhere. So I'm delighted to speak to you. And I've been thinking, since I'm speaking to a department of psychiatry, that I could have been one of your colleagues, because way back, that's what I was supposed to become. I was supposed to become a psychiatrist, not a neurologist. I'll tell you a little bit more about that, but I would like to situate it because it sort of made me think about this connection. At any rate, what I plan to do today, as the title that I gave to Rael indicates, is to discuss a few concepts that I think are very often confused, and that it's quite useful to distinguish them clearly, and they have to do with affect in general and with emotions and feelings in particular. I think this is an area that can deal with a little bit of clarification, so I will address that, and then I will connect the whole notion of affect with notions that have to do with consciousness, which is one of my great passions and scientific interests, and which is something that I've now spent quite a good time thinking about and writing about, and more about it in a second. But then let me start with this preface. So as Rael said, I was born in Portugal, in Lisbon, and I sort of at a certain point in my development, I sort of was destined to become a physician, but I think I was destined to become a psychiatrist. And in fact, very often in my days of high school and talking to different people who were influences in my life, I thought that psychiatry was really the thing that interested me the most. What's interesting is that when I went to medical school, finally, what happened is that the School of Psychiatry in Lisbon was, interestingly, a very neural school. And the chair of neurology and the chair of psychiatry were actually sort of friends and competitors, but totally devoted to what then became known as neuroscience. And they were, of course, very, very good in their respective fields, but neuroscience was, and science in general, was their interest. This was a very neuro group. Quite interestingly, and some of you will know the story of Egas Muniz, who was the founder of these departments, and who, for some of you, you'll know that he was the inventor of prefrontal leucotomy. That, which is both, an interesting scientific development, but a very questionable treatment, gives you an idea of how neural-oriented these people were. They were psychiatrists, but they clearly wanted to have an understanding of the neural basis of psychiatric illness, and they were completely connected with neurologists. Of interest also is that this man, Egas Muniz, who did get the Nobel Prize, was also the developer of cerebral angiography. So it's interesting that one of the methods that was fundamental for us to understand human brain function and to diagnose neurological disease long before the days of CT scans and MR scans, this man was actually the chair of psychiatry. So you get the idea of how interconnected these fields were. And in retrospect, I think it was a good thing. I think it made psychiatry more solid in that particular school. And it had, of course, its flaws, but most of all, it's interesting intellectually. So eventually, when I went through medical school, by the time I would have become a resident in psychiatry, I became a resident in neurology. And that was a good thing for me, but I never lost my interest in mental diseases, quote unquote, and above all in mental processes. This started early on with a very strong interest in language. In fact, my main thesis, there are two theses in my doctorate, but my main thesis was about disturbances of language, of course, caused by focal lesions. But so all of this area of both human psychology and human neuroscience were very, very close in my training. And so this makes me a sort of fellow traveler of you psychiatrists, and you. I look upon psychiatry always with great interest, and if I can contribute anything to your work, so much the better. Okay, so goals for this lecture. I wanted to just hone in directly on these concepts of emotion and feeling, and make sure we are clear about fundamental distinctions that we have to observe, and which unfortunately we tend not to find both in the world of neuroscience as well as in the world of psychology and psychiatry. So when you talk about emotion, and even the word and the root of the word emotion, you're talking about movement, and you're talking about movements that you can observe. So I never talk about emotions as something that I experience, as something internal. I talk about emotions when I can describe them in an individual that is before me, whether it be a patient or a non-patient subject. And so it is something that you can find and that you can observe in the face and in the body posture of the individual. And all emotions that you can think of, whether you're thinking of joy or fear or anger or compassion or sadness, they all have a motor expression. There is a whole set of actions that are revealed predominantly and interestingly in the face, because we have all of this incredibly rich motility in the face, and the face has always been the way of expressing emotion most tellingly. But of course, don't confine yourselves with the face, because you have all sorts of things that happen with the arms, with the posture, with the gait. If somebody's emoting and walking at the same time, which is of course frequent, you have all of these sides of for emotion expression. So one way of recalling all this is to, I like to say that emotions are about theater. Emotion is theatrical stuff. And it's quite interesting, because if you pay a little bit of attention to what happened in acting schools are very predominantly about teaching of emotions and teaching how to act emotions. When you think about the actors and actresses that you admire and respect, whether in theater or in film, you actually admire the most the people who are natural, quote unquote, when they emote. And of course, they're not suffering horrible things when they cry, but there they are doing it so believably that you think they are going through it. And that's what you admire. That's what gives people awards in acting. But back to my classification, it is about theater. Now, all of this is reversed when it comes to feelings. You don't see feelings ever. You don't observe feelings. You can observe expressions, that are emotive or not, and that have to do with feelings. But feelings are the contrary of theater. Feelings are experiences. They're internal. They're going on in your mind. And you can perfectly well hide your feelings. In fact, you can have a lot of emotions that you can use and be very technical and competent about, and that will completely disguise and make people not think about what you are actually feeling. So this fundamental distinction is very important to make. And there's one more reason why this is important, is that very often people, when they think of, not only do they confuse emotions and feelings, which I think is bad, but they very often think of feelings only when they are connected to emotions. So if, of course, all of a sudden I am frightened and I have an emotive mask and expression of fear, it goes without saying that I will feel fear as well. So I can feel the motor behaviors that constitute one of my emotions. And I like to call that an emotional feeling. So if you are sad or joyful or fearful or angry, you can talk about emotional feelings that correspond to those emotions. Perfectly legitimate, nothing wrong with that. Now, what the problem is that we very often ignore a huge collection of feelings that in the evolution of living creatures, and certainly in the evolution of humans, came long before emotional feelings. And those are called homeostatic feelings. This, by the way, is my term. I started using that distinction between emotional feelings and homeostatic feelings, and I coined that term to call attention to the fact that homeostatic feelings are the ones that have appeared spontaneously, and by the way, not only in humans, none of this is strictly human, and have appeared to signify and correspond to situations of life regulation, situations in which we are struggling to maintain homeostasis. So what are the homeostatic feelings that I want you to remember and never call anything but homeostatic feelings? And they include hunger, thirst, pain, well-being, malaise, desire. We can stop right there. And this gives you a range that is most of what I call homeostatic feelings happens in one of these areas. So now let's examine what happens with these, because they're very telling. Well, I don't need to explain to anybody what it feels like and what it is like to be hungry or thirsty. You just have it, and you know it, and you have a tremendous amount of knowledge that comes with it, and you have an affect that goes with it. It's not necessarily an emotion in the strict sense. It is an affect. It's a sense of quality and intensity that is related to that particular feeling. So when you are thirsty, you can be very, very thirsty, intense thirst, or you can be gently thirsty and you feel like you want to drink. And when you are in pain, you also have something that is very well defined and that normally points to some part of your body where things are not going as they should, and where you're being called attention to so that you do something about it. But again, pain will come with a certain intensity. It can be minor, it can be permanent, or it can be on and off, and it can be passable, or it can be extremely intense. And it can have a quality which is tolerable, or a quality which gives it, something that really needs tending to very rapidly. So the fact that you have the quality and intensity and the fact that you have this immediate relation to the body, which happens in all of these things that I mentioned, well-being, pain, hunger, desire, there is an experience of your body in relation to one of these needs that come out of where you are in the world of homeostatic regulation. And so all of this is what defines this world of homeostatic feeling, which I don't need to insist is obviously different from having the plain feeling of being joyful or the plain feeling of being angry at somebody that did something terrible to you. So if you can distinguish these two worlds, that would be great. And of course, I cannot think of any medical practitioners with more need to make this distinction than people in psychiatry, because a lot of the pathology that you have to deal with is pathology where something of this sort is happening. Whether it is homeostatic feelings or emotional feelings, there's plenty of pathology where there is something that may not be quite right or something that is actually grievously bad and that needs correction. And a lot of the activity of psychiatry, whether it is in the human presence with the patient or the administration of drugs, has to do with corrections. They have to do with this work. So I don't think this is a small issue. I think it is a very big issue. Now, let me now turn things around and leave psychiatry partly to think about something that is one of my interests, which is to understand consciousness. And to give you the good news that after many years of working on this subject, I'm now more and more convinced that what I have just been telling you about, and particularly the things I've just told you on homeostatic feelings, all of this is critical to understand the world of consciousness. And so the first thing I need to say is that the world of consciousness is a very messy world in terms of the research. If I were to go to any audience, yours, for example, or the audiences that I speak to a lot of the time, and I would ask for definitions of consciousness, it would be a spectacle because people give very different definitions. And even people that are professional and that have studied psychology or cognitive science or philosophy or psychiatry or neurology, they give widely different definitions of consciousness. And this has been one of the big problems in research on the field, is that although people make all sorts of pointed statements, and you have people like, for example, my philosophy colleague, David Chalmers, who say, well, he says there is a hard problem of consciousness, that's his coinage of the term, and it can't be solved. It's a mystery and will stay forever a mystery. We have no prayer even in understanding what consciousness is all about. And then you have all the other simple problems, the ones that are not hard and that we can understand, such as understanding memory, language, thinking in general, and so forth. All of that is very simple. Well, not so simple, but he calls it simple by comparison with the unfathomable problem of consciousness. I think this is just wrong. And I've told him so several times, and I tell people that think this way that this is just not correct. It would be very difficult to imagine that at this point in our scientific development, this would be an untreatable, undiscoverable problem. But I also like to tell people that one of the great problems is where you're coming from. So if you think of consciousness as something that has to do with, say, the so-called mind-body problem, and that consciousness is what happens when you have a mind that is coming from an organic setting and it becomes consciousness, which for some people is a sort of miracle and for others is a perfectly tolerable situation. And people say, well, it's not really mind, it's consciousness, it's that mysterious transformation that happens in organic stuff that suddenly becomes, quote unquote, mental stuff. Well, I don't think that that's the issue. Then there are people that will say, well, consciousness is really about this huge capacity that we have to have all of these mental contents at a single time, in which you can have an idea of yourself and an idea of others, and you have this gigantic spectacle that allows you to encompass landscapes and a novel that you're reading and the conversations that you're having with a colleague. Well, this is, again, not a correct definition of consciousness. This is a description of very complex, large-scale mental events that are being produced in an organic setting with a nervous system located in a particular body. But I think that goes well beyond what consciousness is. And so, whether people like it or not, my definition of consciousness is minimalist, and it simply has to do with the issue of reference and ownership of the body. So you all and I, at this moment, are having things that are happening in our minds. We're related, for example, to the thoughts I'm transmitting to you, and you are receiving them and commenting. Some of you thinking this is intriguing, some of you thinking this guy is a fool. Never mind. We're having that, and we're having this marvelous thing happening. All of this is automatically referred to our organism, is automatically referred to your bodies, to be more plain speak. And there is a sense of ownership of the mind. In other words, at no point do you ask yourself, gee, this stuff that I'm hearing from this guy, Damasio, is this happening to me? Or could this be happening to the person that is sitting next to me? This is a complete absurdity because it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen because your mind is located in your organism, and that organism is, in fact, your body. And that includes, of course, not only your body, but your body with nervous system, with all its interactions. And so consciousness is about the mutual ownership of mind and body. And what you need to explain, and it's a tall order to explain it, is how is it that I automatically know when I think, when I go through the processes of mind that we're all engaging in, that I know automatically, spontaneously, that this is in fact happening to me? Where does that come from? And through the years, there have been all sorts of attempts to deal with this problem. They go back a long way, but if we just focus on let's say, the past 50 years, during which neuroscience as such arose and became spectacularly developed, producing this string of prize-winning discoveries that have to do with perception, that have to do with how the nervous system is organized, with anatomy, with physiology, all of this. And people started out, unfortunately, at the wrong end. And I was privy to a lot of the early events because I had the opportunity of working closely with Francis Crick and with people that worked with Francis Crick and with David Hubel. And as you know, these are people that devoted their lives first to the study of their part of the nervous system. In the case of Francis Crick, it was not nervous system, was DNA, but were very, very concerned with the mind and very concerned with how biology could explain the mind. And lo and behold, where Francis, who is easily one of the most intelligent people I've ever met and a dear friend, where Francis wanted to start was with vision. he admired David Hubel and Thorsten Wiesel so much for their discoveries on the visual system that he said, well, let's use this as a model because it's this kind of detail and complexity that is going to reveal to us what consciousness is. And in fact, the first papers they published on the topic were about visual consciousness to begin with. And so again, you could not have started at a more incorrect end because you started at the top of the scale of complexity precisely with one of the systems that is most developed in nature, which is the visual system and even the human visual system. And the question that I posed myself, that led to many interesting discussions, and that I still pose myself today, and I ask you to pose to yourselves. You look around the creatures that live with you, not just humans, but look at dogs and cats and other creatures that are equipped with nervous systems and have relatively complex behaviors. And one thing you can be reasonably sure is that they are conscious. They are not asleep all the time. They're not anesthetized. They are interacting with the world, and they are interacting with the world in ways that, except for their lack of language like ours, and their lack of as robust an intellect as we have, are very similar to ours. And those interactions are obviously happening in a world of consciousness. So you have to ask yourself, is it likely that this world of consciousness that you can recognize going down the scale of living organisms into extremely simple organisms, provided they have a nervous system, that this would have started with the complexities that you have in our visual system or in our very elaborate cerebral cortices? And the answer is that it's very unlikely. And so to make a long story short, the hypothesis that we have arrived at, and this is actually work that is largely mine and Hannah's, is different than I'm going to tell it to you. And by sheer coincidence, there are just two papers that we have finished, and they are both accepted for publication. One is in Brain. Brain is as you probably know, the original and main neurological journal. It's an English journal. Couldn't have a better name than Brain. And the other is in another journal called Neural Computation. And we have papers on consciousness, and they both were, in fact, one went out, the final copy yesterday, and another is going out today, and they're both accepted in those two journals. And it is about the hypothesis that now I'm going to summarize. So I'm going to give you the latest on the subject. Point number one, where we think consciousness starts with feelings, and guess what? It's homeostatic feelings. So all my spiel about homeostatic feelings serves a purpose in this lecture, is just to key you in the critical observation in all of this work. And that is that homeostatic feelings are spontaneously conscious. It's quite astonishing that people do not point this out, but just imagine what would be the contrary of this. Imagine that you were hungry, but you were not conscious that you were hungry. What would that be? It's a complete absurdity. When you have hunger or when you have pain, you have hunger and pain, and you are conscious of those states. And the value of homeostatic feelings is in their natural, spontaneous, automatic consciousness. If they were not conscious, who would care? And our thesis is that homeostatic feelings were the inaugural events of consciousness in evolution. And once they appeared in evolution, they introduced such advantages to the creatures that were conscious, that had those feelings, that they were selected and they stayed on for the rest of time. Okay, so Consciousness for us begins with homeostatic feelings. They bring consciousness into play. And then, provided you have any kind of thought, any kind of experience that is accompanied by one of those feelings, you are going to have consciousness, because it's the feeling that lends consciousness to whatever cognitive process you have. So instead of starting from high cognition and going down in search of consciousness, we start from low homeostatic feelings and go up. And we want homeostatic feelings to land and attribute consciousness to the things that are co-experienced. So if I am looking out at the landscape outside my windows, I am looking at that landscape and I'm conscious of it because I am at the same time experiencing homeostatic feelings. And you might say at this point, no, wait a minute. So didn't you talk about hunger, thirst, desire, and so forth? These things sort of come and go. Would you be non-conscious in between? And I'm anticipating your question to tell you no, because in fact, the most continuous and permanent homeostatic feeling we have is the feeling of existence itself and the feeling of life. We are constantly, when we are near equilibrium, we feel we are alive, definitely. And it is the deviations from that average that cause the thirst, the hunger, the pain, the well-being, which is an increase in that feeling of life in the good direction, or the malaise that we feel. So we are continuously experiencing these homeostatic feelings. There's no break, because the only thing, if you break, you die. Or if you break, it means that you're dead. There's no break, and those homeostatic feelings are conferring the possibility of consciousness, which you then apply. It's literally plastered on to whatever you hear or see or taste or touch. So that is the fundamental point. Now, before I leave the subject, I want to tell you a little bit about how we think these actions put together. I think the idea in itself is interesting, but as usual in science, ideas are valuable if you have some means of testing them, and if you have some means of proving them horribly wrong or horribly right. And so this is what I would like now to advance to. And so what is the physiology behind homeostatic feelings? How is it that you get to have this feeling of life? How is it that you get to have a feeling of pain? And the answer is very interesting. It comes out of a whole area of neuroscience that we call introception. Okay, now what is introception? As the name indicates, it is about the quote unquote perception of the interior of the organism. Okay, and that's what you use to distinguish from extroception, which is what I do when I look out and see my desk and have everything visual, or when I touch my writing pad, or when I smell the air and so forth. That's extroception. And also somewhat distinct from proprioception, which has to do with our ability to sense where striated muscles are in terms of their contraction, and how those striated muscles are moving skeletal parts. That's the world of proprioception. It's really, proprioception is in between intro and extro. Extro is really about the outside. Intro is totally about the inside. And this is where I want you to look carefully and see something beautiful that people tend not to pay attention to, is that it's not just that there's the interior and the exterior, is that the conditions under which they operate are remarkably different. Conditions of the interior are such that you are generating imagetic patterns. You are generating maps of objects that are inside your living organism. You can have an object, for example, your gut, that can be contracted or distended, or you can have your throat, or you can have your skin, the interoceptive component of your skin. All of those are objects, but look at this extraordinary thing. They're objects that are inside your organism, and your nervous system is inside your organism as well. So what happens is that if you perceive, as a result, for example, of a variety of chemical mediators being in the circulation, if you perceive a certain organ as contracted or as distended, you have not only the possibility of perceiving it, but then you have the possibility from your nervous system, automatically, without even the intervention of your will, you have the possibility of responding to that pattern and generating an interaction. Now, if I look out the window and I see a landscape, I'm seeing it thanks to the photons that come into my retina, but I have no possibility of going from my retina and influencing the landscape. They're worlds apart. In the world of interoception, you have, because you're quote unquote perceiving things that are inside your organism, you have this complete possibility of back and forth between the nervous system and the topic, the object that you are allegedly perceiving. So I don't call this a perception, this is an interaction, and this is a hybrid. Now, to make matters worse or better in our case for the hypothesis, is that all of this operates on a very different language neurally that the outside operates on. The language of the outside, or from the outside, is operated by the most modern elements of the nervous system. Fully myelinated neurons, extremely well protected from the blood by a blood-brain barrier. When you look at the stuff that is coming from our internal organs and from the chemistry of our interior into our brain, couldn't have anything more different. You have, first of all, a lot of neurons that don't have myelin and that are completely open to the influence of chemical molecules in the vicinity. Moreover, those neurons are, of course, naked and they don't have myelin to support them. But then there are also huge gaps in the blood-brain barrier, as a result of which you have the chemistry in your blood circulation can directly affect even structures of the central nervous system, and they do so especially in regions of the brainstem, where we have gaps in the blood-brain barrier. And you have something quite extraordinary. All the information that is coming from your body into your brain about your body is transported via ganglia that come into the spinal cord or that come into the brainstem. Okay, now, lo and behold, those ganglia have huge gaps, like huge holes in the blood-brain barrier, so that even at the level of the ganglia, you have the possibility of having the blood circulation and whatever is in the blood circulation, which can, by the way, be a medication or something you ate or drank, having an influence on the neurons themselves. So I'm pointing out that this hypothesis that interoception is critical and that interoception produces a hybrid that is not just plain perception is strengthened by the fact that this is a remarkably different creature in terms of the neural processes. And that is what we think is critical to generate this phenomena of interoceptive feeling, which we call homeostatic feeling, and which will give away the possibility of localizing and identifying your body. So to put it in one sentence, you know you're conscious because your homeostatic feelings are saying, hello, we're here, this is happening in your body. And everything that is happening in your mind is accompanied by this knowledge that the homeostatic feelings are giving spontaneously, that I'm here, this is my body, this is happening to me. There's no mystery about this. You don't need to try to look for it in quantum physics. It's not there. Although, I'll just say a little parenthesis for those who might be interested, I'm actually convinced that the sensing element that is underneath the perceptual element that you have in introception is happening in parts of cells that don't even need to be neural cells, and where quantum effects could be possible. And I'm saying this just to call your attention to the fact that plants and bacteria, which do not have nervous systems, have the possibility of sensing the milieu they're in, have the possibility of responding to some of what they sense, even if they are not conscious. And the reason why they're not conscious is A, they don't have nervous systems, and B, they don't create maps and representations of the stimuli that connect with them. So they are not privy to the world of consciousness because of those two lacks, nervous system and the possibility of representation. And so it's a different world. And I would say just one more thing that is of great interest is that anesthesia, which does suspend consciousness, does not suspend consciousness by acting directly on the intermediate processes that we think are relevant to generate consciousness, but rather by suspending the process of sensing, which is the reason why anesthetics, the same anesthetics that you can give for general anesthesia in humans, will be applied to a plant and the plant stops. There's nothing going on metabolically in the plant. There's a suspension of life activities in the plant, even if the plant does not have nervous system, does not have a mind, obviously. And so when people are confronted with the paradox of plants that become anesthetized, they have to ask themselves, wait a minute, is this anesthesia acting in the same point that the loss of consciousness that we have when you fall into deep sleep produces? And the answer is obviously not. This is a different world. And just one last point for you, and that is that we have diseases of consciousness that we can identify in neurology. And lo and behold, they all point into the direction of a key structure in the central nervous system. And that is a set of structures in the upper brainstem. And you know this from studies of coma. So, and this is something that neurology helps us with. When you have a patient that has a stroke and has coma, that patient has almost invariably, if it's really coma and not something that looks like coma, that patient has damage by stroke in the posterior part of the upper brainstem, so mid-pons and above. And those regions are the regions where you have nuclei that integrate information from interoception. This is where the interoceptive stuff lands when it comes into the central nervous system. And then it's extremely uncommon to have problems with consciousness, at least major problems, with a simple stroke that you may have, say, in the temporal parietal lobe, which can affect your memory, your language, but it's very difficult to affect consciousness. There are exceptions, and when they occur, they have to do with integrative regions that occur in the temporoparietal cortices and in a set of cortices called posteromedial cortices, PMC, which is in the medial surface and parietal, and literally they look at each other across the midline in the brain. And those are very rare, and what they mostly, what strokes in that area mostly produce is disturbances of the possibility of having normal cognition. and you have a lot of problems, but not the problem of sort of the eradication of consciousness, which is something that is much more related to introception when it is centralized in nuclei of the upper brainstem. So I'm so enthusiastic about this that I went well over my time, I now see, and I'm going to shut up and take your questions with great pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Damasio. A wonderful overview of some of your recent thinking on consciousness and the centrality of these different domains of feeling. As a reminder for everyone, I put it in the chat box a short time ago. There's a time for question and answers now. And if you put either in the Q&A or the chat box, we will keep our eye on it, and I will pass the questions along to Dr. Dimaggio. So to start with, we have from Lindsay Crown. Given the bottom-up approach to consciousness that you describe, which I very much like, what is the role of, say, the prefrontal cortex? Is it a top-down filter to suppress feelings, or something that instead enhances them and gives color and reason to our basic feelings? For disorders of affect, should we be looking top-down, bottom-up, in your opinion?
Very well. So prefrontal cortex, which interestingly is very often been connected with consciousness, clearly in the picture that I just drew for you, is not related to consciousness. It's related to a high-level control of our cognition. In fact, most of our basic cognition requires cerebral cortices, but it's the posterior cerebral cortices. It's cortices that are in temporal and parietal and occipital regions. It's there that you're making the patterns of images that represent the outside world and that also represent possible combinations of the outside world. Now, you need, in order to be conscious, to sort of illuminate those patterns with the light that comes from homeostatic feelings, and that is in fact being produced at a lower level in the central nervous system. Now, the prefrontal cortices are clearly related to the process of reasoning, to the process of manipulating all the contents that you have imagetically in your posterior cortices. So, for example, right now, I'm here in my study, I'm looking at Rael on the screen of my iPad, and that's all visual processing. But at the same time, I'm also, I have in quote unquote the back of my mind, a set of imagetic patterns that represent the broader situation in which I am in. I know that I'm lecturing to you in the Department of Psychiatry, and I'm imagining actually some of you posing questions that I'm then responding to. Now, how I do that is by using a manipulation that probably comes from several prefrontal cortices and generates modifications of the flow of images, and that are still being represented in my thinking in an imagetic pattern flow. But that's what the prefrontal cortex is doing. And when you ask me a question like you just did, that question requires a sort of decoding that the prefrontal cortex helps me do. So if I had a double prefrontal leucotomy, it's unlikely that I would be able to respond to it. Thank you.
Yes, yeah. One of our current audience members, Dr. Kaplan, who you know well, has the following comment. You asked, what is hunger if we're not conscious of it? Is not the purpose of hunger to drive eating behavior, whether or not we're aware of it? For example, could I find myself eating without ever realizing that I was hungry? Another way to ask this question is, if unconscious drives that organize and motivate behavior can exist, then why do we need conscious ones?
Okay. So, very interesting question. Practically anything that happens in our minds can be clearly conscious or less so. And of course, one doesn't have any problem with the notion of an unconscious drive. It's clearly that it probably exists. But we know of our unconscious drives through consciousness. We know of our unconscious drives when you do have a conscious drive and you reflect that it probably was there a while before you actually noticed it in consciousness. So and clearly when the homeostatic feelings that I talked about, and especially the feeling of pain is, I think, is a very prime example. You're talking about consciousness. It needs. I don't really know what is unconscious pain, although I'm ready to accept that there are states in which it was almost there but not quite, and you can finesse that state that way. But the critical point is that these homeostatic states are flourish when they are conscious, and they are naturally conscious. They are offering themselves to us without any need of great calculations.
Clear. And it is 12:59. We have a few more questions coming up. And I just want to acknowledge that for some in the Department of Psychiatry in particular, who may have some clinical duties to get back to, this might be a necessary time to log off. But if you have time for a few more questions, Dr. Damasio, we can continue on for those who are able to stay.
Right. And I'm not yet the hunger or thirst, so.
Okay. And for those who do have to leave, thank you very much for joining. So James is asking, any information about the contributions of genetic and developmental influences on setting the upper and lower values for homeostatic values that generate hunger, pain signals to consciousness?
Interesting question. I do not know anything about it. I think that it's quite clear that that thresholds are different for different people, and they are different even in the same people in different circumstances. Anybody that has the experience of traveling over time zones knows that waking up 10 hours of time difference later makes a lot of things that are happening in our organism different. And so there are different thresholds, there are different points at which certain things set in within the same individual, given different circumstances. And it stands to reason that there are differences in individuals. I do not know anything about the genetic differences, and actually I think it's a very interesting thing to study, and probably would give interesting information that would be relevant to thinking about consciousness as well.
Great. And a question that's kind of a clarification from Dr. Grant, just asking if she got the gist of what you're trying to say with regards to drives and homeostatic feelings. Are they really essentially equivalent? Homeostatic feelings are what in psychiatry we call drives?
Yeah, certainly. In relation to, homeostatic feelings is a way of describing it in terms of the circumstances and in terms of what they are, cognitively, psychologically. But they are clearly drives are part of this overall picture. I don't think you have a drive for pain, but you certainly have drives for sex and food. So don't have any problem with you calling them drives. But in the end, if you have a drive, you're going to express that drive mentally as a feeling.
And it seems that it would be fair to say that drives could be a subset of homeostatic feelings, because there are some homeostatic feelings that are certainly that you pointed to that do not.
Yeah. And how you generate the overall map of this it depends on your approach, but I don't have any problem with you calling them drives because they are drives.
Yeah.
But they are drives that cause a certain feeling.
And one question I would be interested to hear your thoughts about. I know that contemplative practices and mindfulness have not been a particular fascination of yours to date. That being said, many of those of us in that field of studying mindfulness and contemplative practices have benefited greatly from a lot of the insights and from your work. And one of the models that occurs to me in hearing you speak about this kind of latest elaboration of homeostatic feelings and their centrality to consciousness is that in the practice of engaging in meditative practice, really where attention lays intentionally is primarily on homeostatic feelings. Now, of course, the mind gets caught up in thinking, but you're continually bringing it back to this body sitting here and now, the fluctuations of all of the interoceptive senses, as well as the exteroceptive senses, and these mechanisms that you described, like the hunger that comes and goes, passes, rises away. And there's an interesting phenomenon that people describe of becoming more conscious of what was previously not as conscious to them. And that's part of what they feel is contributing to the sense of well-being and benefit that they get from those practices. Just curious if you have any reflections on that conceptualization of mindfulness practice as being kind of applying an equanimous, even hovering attention to homeostatic feelings.
Right. Well, my first thought is that, of course, it's extremely interesting. It's extremely interesting that you can, with a technique, that you can manipulate the level of the point at which you are aware of a certain state, and that you can go even beyond that and generate states that otherwise would not have appeared. So by attention to particular fact, you can change the level at which a certain phenomenon occurs or is experienced. In other words, you become conscious of. But you can also change many other things that are around it in the periphery. But it is a periphery that has a lot to do with the experience of your own organism, if I understand it correctly. And of course, here I am. I defer to your experience of these matters, but I can imagine it from what little I know that you can influence these states in a very broad way, but that what you're influencing is critically related to this organismic, natural, basic state. In other words, your sphere of influence, I mean, you enter the mind through this avenue that is the avenue of homeostasis and its connection to consciousness, its natural connection to consciousness. You don't enter it through a cognitive kind of elaboration. You're not.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah.
And interestingly enough, I can speak from personal experience and having heard other meditators describe similar things, especially when one uses the techniques that are subsumed in the general name of Vipassana, the kind of tradition in Buddhist practice out of which mindfulness practices were derived. The attention to somatic sensation generally is really a prime kind of focus for part of one's practice. And so for spending, minutes, hours at a time, just attending to sensation at the level of starting at the barrier, the skin, but then, of course, the musculature and the pains and aches of the body and the kind of excitations and diminutions of kind of waves of sensation throughout the body become more and more distinct to the point that many people experience in an ongoing way, even when they're not practicing, this kind of buzzing sensation of the body that was never experienced before, that was first encountered in meditation, and then becomes a constitutive part of ongoing awareness, some subtle physical manifestation that previously conscious attention never really encountered. And so I'm just curious, knowing that that's one of the transformations people go through in practice of that sort, if you have any thoughts of why that would be and its significance for the change in psychological capacities generally.
That's extremely interesting. And can you describe a little bit more? What is the buzzing like?
It's a sense of, so you can imagine like the feeling of mint on the body, the feeling of a breeze of air across the skin. These very subtle ripples of sensation that essentially normally we only experience when there's a external input that is exciting that part of the body. But when attending very closely, one picks up that such subtle kind of vibratory sensations are present all the time.
Right, got it. Yeah, no, that's very interesting. So what you're probably changing is thresholds. You're changing, but it's interesting because you're sort of sliding into an extroceptive world. So you begin with this attention given to phenomena that are clearly related to introception. And that's the main channel. But at the same time, you are alive and well and normal, and you have other stimuli that are impinging in your organism. And so your face, your skin is still going to be sensitive to temperature, to vibrations of every sort. And so what is interesting is that it's probably the change in the introceptive side drags on some changes on the extroceptive side. That's very interesting. Yeah, but it stands to reason that it should happen that way, because the fact that you're concentrating with your techniques on the introceptive world doesn't mean that the extroceptive disappeared. It's still there. You still have the same nervous system, and you're just changing a little bit the weights at which you're operating. Yeah, that's very interesting. Obviously, I need to know more about that so that I can talk to you guys.
A couple of other quick questions before we wrap up here.
Okay.
Number one, do you have any thoughts on the role of the nucleus ambiguous in consciousness?
Very simple. No.
Okay, this is a good one. We got that out of the way. So Leah Marie is saying, just so wonderful to receive your generous sharing of recent discoveries. Thank you. Can you address the connection of the research on the enteric nervous system and disturbance of microbiome on autoimmune dysregulation?
Yeah, thank you.
The autism spectrum, brain fog, these kinds of things.
Right. No, that's very interesting. And I think that I would say that all of those developments are positive. They're positive on two counts. First, the studies that are being done, and we have, for example, at the BCI, we have one group that is quite interested on issues of microbiome, and autism as well. So the studies that are being done have the possibility of enlarging what we know already about introception. Clearly, people have spent most of their efforts in neuroscience on the extroceptive systems, and I can understand that perfectly well. You want to know more about the world around, that's all fine. But the world of, as I suggested at the beginning, the world of mental illness in particular is very much related to this world of the interior in many, many ways, far more than the high cognitive, though of course, it's not true that it would be across the board. So I think that the possibility of having more tools to study this phenomena in the normal individual and the possibility of having applications in pathology is great. So I'm all for it. And that's the reason why when a few years ago there was the possibility of having a group that was interested in these issues, we thought it was perfectly appropriate for the Brain Creativity Institute, where we wanted to be across the board and study things that are high cognition as well as this humble introceptive world. Thank you very much for your good.
It certainly is a fascinating new area in neuroscience. I'm sure that questions will keep coming in as long as you speak. So I'm to give you a little bit of a break, I'm just going to end with one that I think is a great integrative question that's recently come in.
Okay.
And with apologies to everyone else that we can't get to today. So Don Moorer asks, can you please describe a practical implication or implications of your view of human consciousness for nurturing one's health and well-being?
Okay, when you talk about practical, I'm immediately thought about practical in the world of the world of neuroscience and the world of neurology. Well, I think something that is very practical and important is some of the distinctions that I referred to last in my talk, and making people aware of this the sort of stepwise development of functions like sensing, which I normally refer to as sensing/detecting, and responding, which is, of course, what you can have when you touch a plant, or when you touch, even under the microscope, you touch a bacterium, and you have, say, a contraction or a deviation of the movement of the bacterium. So functions that are very much related to the operations that are going on in cells, but not necessarily nervous cells, and that do not require a coordinating nervous system. So that's one part of the world that is, in fact, probably the most frequent of the world. There stands to reason that going to be more living creatures with sensing possibilities than living creatures with sensing and minding, let alone sensing and minding and consciousness. So we are on the other side of the spectrum, capable not only of sensing, because we do have that, there are responses that we have in our skin, for example, that are at the sensing level, and we're not even aware that they are there, and yet our organism can respond. But then when we have minding, we have something quite distinct, which is this possibility of generating maps and making representations. So whether it's an auditory map or a tactile map or a visual map, you plot the stuff that is happening, and that map is going to constitute a representation, and that representation is going to be the basis for what we call images. When we think, we use images in our thought. So For example, I'm right now, I'm imagining the person that asked this question, and I have a sort of vague sketch that allows me to give the answer to this person that I've never seen, maybe. Anyway, so there's the sensing and detecting, and there's the minding, and then as a consequence of another layer of complication, which is the maps and these particular kinds of maps that are being generated by introception, you have the possibility of putting all that connected to an organism. And then that organism can subsequently develop all sorts of constructions, mental constructions, about what the world is like and about what that organism itself is like. Because we are here making sense of this conversation because each of us has not only homeostatic feelings, but you have homeostatic feelings and you have all this huge amount of knowledge that we have put in our cerebral cortices and that we can call up and manipulate. And we have connected all this with a sense of self. So that that first sense of being conscious, which has to do with the body belonging with the mind, is then augmented when you have a sense of our organisms as a whole being connected to a particular history, which is each of us has, of being born and growing up and having a number of events happening to us, which is our self-consciousness. And of course, these are all very different levels. And maybe just to close, go back to this point, let's not try to understand consciousness beginning from the top and starting with all of our self-consciousness that we have this moment, but rather beginning with something credibly working at very low level and making this bridge between a mental image and the living organism, such that that bridge then allows us to develop the self and eventually a self-consciousness. And my problem has always been with starting at the top when you want to explain something that clearly has had to begin in a very humble way in order to reach the current levels. Okay, guys.
Well, thank you so much for that, Dr. Damasio.
Now I'm going to develop hunger and thirst all at the same time, and I'm going to have lunch.
Wonderful.
And
so thank you again for being with us today, and thank you all for tuning in. Looking forward to see you at the next event. And Dr. Dimaggio, just really a big thank you from all of us for sharing your wisdom with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.